Hi, my name is Marcin Żebrowski, and this is my podcast about cities, Urbcast. Hi, and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, in which I will discuss the safety aspect of our cities. And today I invited Lotte Fast Carlsen, who is the Deputy Director at Nordic Safe Cities. And yes, we will focus on safety in the Nordic cities. However, it was extremely interesting to me to get to know how can the knowledge accumulated in the Nordic Safe Cities network be shared with the cities outside Nordic region. And you might, of course, as well think that Nordic cities tend to be safe, and you will be right. But as every city and every region, the Nordic region also has its own problems. And one of them might be the presence of extremism groups who would like to recruit young people especially. And that's how also a bad thing happened a couple of years ago in Copenhagen, which was a terrorist attack in the very central part of Copenhagen. And since then, some measures were taken to make our cities more safe and to share the knowledge between the different cities and their city councils to preserve the safety in the Nordic region. So today I will focus on a safe city thinkcubator, the Nordic Safe Cities. We will talk about this alliance, and we will talk about how the cities can be a part of it and what are the main objectives behind this thinkcubator, as well as we will talk about New Safe Urban Spaces publication, which is a publication made by SLA Architects and Nordic Safe Cities together under the name of Safe Urban Spaces Task Force, where for 1 year they've been investigating the cities, Nordic Safe Cities network, and they came up with several safe spaces principles on how should we design our spaces for safety, how should we approach different groups that occupy different spaces, because you might be familiar with a situation that you have a park and there are different groups of users of such a park. So, for example, there might be just people who go for a round, there might be parents with a child in a trolley, but also you might have people who do drugs or homeless people, and you might not feel safe in such a park where you are surrounded by some big trees and some dark corners, and you might approach people from different groups. But what is important, and it will be also mentioned in our talk with Lotte, is that you can't talk about some excluded group. You need to talk to that group, to the members of this group, because they might know the place the best. Since, for example, a homeless person would spend a lot of time in a park, for example, so he or she might know the park the best. So it is important that we, as designers and also in general, as trying to make our places more livable, more including and safe, we just reach out to those people and just try to provide them with more comfort in a space as well. So that was another aspect. And so that's the knowledge that the Nordic Safe Cities network has. And that's why I really wanted to talk to a representative of this interesting network. So now I would like to just invite you to our talk with Lotte. Hi Lotte, thank you for visiting me in my show.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very pleased to be here.
It's very nice to meet you, especially just at the place we are right now in a very nice room, and it's nice to see you in real life. But yeah, I just wanted to start and to talk about the very interesting topic, which is the safety in our cities and especially in the Nordic cities. But of course, before that, I just wanted to ask you for like a short introduction.
I am the Deputy Director of Nordic Safe Cities, and I've been part of this founding team since it was established back in 2016. And here I am responsible for advising and helping Nordic cities to create more safe and inclusive societies and prevent violent extremism, radicalization, and polarization. Well, before that, I have a background from Copenhagen Business School, where I have a master's degree in international business and politics. But I've worked for many years with social entrepreneurship and sustainable development. For one thing, I've worked in Ethiopia with health issues there, worked on building up an app for healthcare providers to help them in maternal health, which was very interesting and very different actually for what I'm doing now, but very interesting. And then I've worked for many years as a consultant on building up alliances and private-public partnerships on some of the critical issues that we have here in the Nordic countries and in Denmark.
It's a very mixed experience that you have, very broad, very vast one. And I think that might also help you nowadays with the work that you do. But when did it start with this interest in cities, or maybe rather the safety in cities?
Yeah, well, I think, being educated from a business school, I could have, of course, been running for the money. I could have been wearing high heels and a very tight dress and be very aware of how I could earn a lot of money. But that was kind of never for me. I think I've always knew that I kind of always taken my responsibility quite seriously. And I thought it was very natural that we all did that. I think that's perhaps a very Nordic naive approach to it. But anyway, it's guided my choices in my life. It's always been a focus on what can I do and how can I help. And I think living in a region, in a Nordic region, where we have a very high level of trust and very high level of health and welfare system, it seemed for me very absurd not to look into why do people not feel included in our cities? Why are there still people who don't feel that they belong and so on? So it felt very natural for me to look into that and see how could I use my skills as social entrepreneurship and so on to try to think this in a different approach. And that's why it felt very natural to work with that area. So I think for some people, it's the money who guides them. For some people, it's these, their creativity and so on. But I think for me, knowing that I'm doing something special and maybe kind of changing some few lives over there, and that's what makes me happy.
I guess it's also connected somehow with just meeting people, with this social part as well, as it works for me very well. I'm very happy that we could just meet together and that this episode's gonna be heard by many people, I hope, and they will also try, maybe, I hope, to change something in their life or their surroundings. And since this is the podcast about urbanism and architecture, and I have also the Architecture Offices series here in my show, I think that it's important to introduce and emphasize Nordic Safe Cities, as this is not an architecture office, it's not a design office, it's actually something that is called a thinkcubator. And we will just explain it very shortly. A safe city thinkcubator, actually. And when I first saw your publication, and this is also kind of this the spark that led me to inviting you to the podcast, is that I was thinking, okay, Nordic Safe Cities, like why do we need even a company like that in Nordic cities? Because I think that they are just very safe. So maybe if we can just kind of establish the ground for the future parts of our talk and just introduce how the Nordic Safe Cities came up to be. What's the story behind it?
Yes, please do so. I think, and you're very right, our prime focus is not as an architectural company. We are something very different. But perhaps to give a picture of why we are here and why it's so important, let me just start from the very beginning. I think back in 2015, actually, Copenhagen was hit by a terrorist attack. A man shot two people, one in front of a synagogue and another who was trying to prevent him from attacking a freedom of speech event in the center of Copenhagen. After that, just following that, the Nordic Council ministers met and were actually to meet about something different. I think it was climate or something, but decided that this attack was so important that they needed to act together and do something about such an episode. And they emphasized the importance of more collaboration and knowledge sharing across the Nordic region. So on the basis of that, it was decided to create a stronger network between the Nordic countries. And let me just say the Nordic countries, that is Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. And we are very similar in the way we are. We actually just before this show started discussed the similarities between Sweden and Danish language, although it is for some people difficult to pronounce it, but it's still very easy to understand the language across the Nordic region, but also our cultures, our values, our welfare systems, very similar. And we also have very similar preventative efforts. The way that we do preventative methods and approaches and so on are very similar, and our structures as well. So we thought it was important to share that knowledge, and we thought there could be an added value about actually sharing our methods and our knowledge across these borders. So that's why we chose to establish a network of cities. And cities is, of course, because in cities, that's where we live. That's where we walk around in our streets. That's where we meet each other. But cities are also, as organizations, very close to citizens. They are also very close to the problems. So it seemed very natural to connect the cities across the Nordic region and to connect the young people, the politicians, the city practitioners, the police, the civil society on how we can create better solutions to prevent violence, crime, but actually more in a focus on violent extremism, radicalization, and in the end, terrorism. So I think 6 years after now, it seems that it's still very important that we're here. We see a lot of tendencies in the world that unfortunately makes it important to still have this connection across the Nordic region. We see our values such as democracy and pluralism and human rights are put under pressure at the moment by more extremist groups. And even now we have what we see in Afghanistan also, of course, makes us aware of what happens now 20 years after 9/11. How has that affected our societies and how can we work even closer on the basis of that? So yeah, that was the long story, but that's also just to give you a perspective of the importance of why we're here and kind of the purpose of what Nordic Safe Cities is all about.
So in other words, it's kind of a network, an alliance of cities, which counts now, correct me if I'm wrong, 21?
20 cities, yeah.
20 cities.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how the cities, the Nordic cities, can join the network, because of course it's not all the Nordic cities that are part of the network. So is there any key or is there any system for them to join the network? How are they being chosen?
Well, I think all cities are welcome. Nordic cities are very welcome to join us. And we have been a strong group of 20 cities the last couple of years who are all of the capital cities and also a lot of the bigger cities. And I think all cities who are struggling with this theme and this focus are very welcome in the network. And we would love to have more cities on board, of course, because I think also sometimes some of the smaller cities have other perspectives on the issue and perhaps are experiencing it from a different angle. And that's why it's so important that we have both the small and the big and the middle-sized cities and from across all of our 5 countries. So cities are very welcome to approach us. That's actually just write me an email. So that's very easy. It's not like we have any like application system or anything. But what is of importance for us and what is also what we see from the cities who are on board now is that they are very engaged. I mean, they are engaged at the political level. All of the politicians have signed to be part of this network. We also have a mayors summit every second year where the mayors meet and talk about how they can improve the politics across the Nordics within this area. We have our city practitioners and police and civil society who work with this focus and area. And we have them, of course, also very connected. And we have these different events and webinars and so on. So it's important, of course, that the cities who are in this alliance is engaged. But then on the other hand, of course, it's every city are very welcome to approach us.
But not outside the Nordic countries. And this is something I wanted to ask about because like once you produce this knowledge, and of course it's Nordic cities, as you explained, with the same kind of culture and political systems and so on. But I was wondering, and that probably I'm sure there are also many other cities around Europe and also world that struggle with safety issues as well. And I was thinking, since like your knowledge is, I assume also during those meetings of mayors and so on, the main language of communication is English, probably. The languages are not similar enough to to just pick one and the Scandinavian languages. So once you produce some knowledge, because I guess that this is what the role of a thinkcubator is, that you produce some kind of expertise, experience and knowledge. And how would you share it with the other cities? Because since they can't kind of maybe join and be a part of Nordic Cities network, how can they use the knowledge you produce?
You are totally right. This is a Nordic network, and that is because we are so similar. It also makes a lot of sense because it's easy to transfer models and approaches and programs and so on. But of course, we're very aware of what goes on out in the world and in other cities, in Europe, but also across the sea and so on, because it's these violent extremist groups. Of course, they don't really care that much about the borders. So it's very important for us to know what goes on and what kind of movements are approaching. And well, lucky us, but we are often experiencing that we are perhaps some of the ones that experience this later than some other cities are in other parts of Europe or the world. So it's very important for us to have a strong collaboration with other cities and networks and organizations, which we do already. We have a very strong collaboration with the EU RAN Radicalization Awareness Network, which is also European cities, the Strong Cities Network, which is cities across the whole world working within the same focus and area. And for us, it's important to share how we are working in the Nordic region, which is also what we will be talking about later in the publication. And the reason why we did this publication is also because we think that there are some interesting models in the Nordics that can be scaled and shared to other European worldwide cities. So yes, we keep a strong focus on keeping that collaboration and knowledge sharing with other networks out there. And of course, I welcome other cities to also approach us, and as well as other organizations, always welcome.
I also thought about one more thing when you've been saying about those different challenges that we have, because can we just introduce maybe some kind of definition of safety and what are the challenges for the safety, like what are the threats in the Nordic cities?
Yeah, I think, of course, safety and security is always, how do you define that? And I mean, for us, our focus is primarily on the prevention of violent extremism, radicalization and polarization. But working in the Nordic region, and that means working in the very early preventative efforts. So that also means looking into how can we get young people into positive communities and not be raided into gangs or extremist groups and so on. So that's in the very early preventative efforts that we work in the Nordic region. But I think one way of showing this is, of course, by perhaps highlighting, we have like 5 themes, you can call it, that we focus on at the moment. These are actually 5 dilemmas or 5 problems that we have identified together with our member cities. So it gives a very good picture of what are some of the challenges that we are actually facing at the moment and how can we then approach this as cities, as city actors. And well, firstly and more broadly, we have a theme that's called A City for All. And that is, of course, related to how do you include everyone in your city so that people don't feel excluded and that you don't lead to more polarization and so on. And that's, of course, to look into, especially at the moment, we have some extreme right-wing groups who are spurring a lot of hate towards other cultures and a lot of racism and hate online and offline and so on. So there's a lot of focus on that. How do we make people feel more included into our cities and societies? And another focus here is an interesting dilemma I will highlight is how do you uphold the whole freedom of speech, which is something that we hold very dear in the Nordic countries, this ability to speak up always. But then how do you then keep protecting that without also protecting hate speech and you want to defend democracy and you want to defend everyone's right to speak up, but you can actually risk defending hate groups and extremist groups as well. So that's a dilemma that we're working quite a lot with. We have at the moment a right-wing extremist person from Denmark who wanted to travel to Sweden to do demonstration. He wanted to burn down a Quran. And of course, that made people very angry and a lot of tension. And how do you then approach that? Because that is legal. You are okay. It's okay to go and demonstrate and yell out very awful things in the street if it's a demonstration and you are protected by the police. But the people in the city feel very offended. And here with this example, we actually set up meetings between Danish cities who are used to handling this with the Swedish cities so that they can manage these demonstrations without it leading to fights in the streets and protests and so on. So that's an interesting theme that we're working quite a lot on at the moment, and that very much is kind of course, affecting everything we do in the network.
I almost want to ask about the thing like who city belongs to, because like the freedom of speech to me is also tied to the city. Like, where do you basically create spaces for people to share their opinion? There is one place, I don't remember the exact name, but in Singapore, there's a park, maybe it's called the Freedom Park, but there is a place that you can basically go to and kind of shout out loud your opinion in a speech. And of course, it has to be like within some limits of culture, of word and so on. So like you can't, of course, like harass anybody and so on. But it brings me, it's just like my question that popped out in my mind, that this freedom of saying what you want is kind of tied to the cities a lot.
It is. And they are experiencing it. I mean, that's also the city who is responsible for the demonstrations. And we have a lot of positive demonstrations at the moment. I mean, we see with the climate change, every Friday we've had demonstrations in Copenhagen, young people fighting for the climate and everything, which has actually worked now, right? So we have Black Lives Matters demonstrations, which are so positive. So we use our streets to show our opinions, to engage in our societies, which can be in a very positive way. But then again, it is the city's role to make the space for this, but also ensure that this does not suddenly lead to more tension, which it can if you have demonstrations with a perhaps less positive agenda, said in a polite way. But then, yes, suddenly it becomes the city's responsibility. And they cannot be the morale. They can't be the ones who say this is something. I mean, there's of course borders to what you can say. There's legal borders, but what if you are within the borders? Who is then the ones to decide, right? So that's a dilemma that you have to think of when you're designing your cities. Yeah, so that's one of our themes. The next one, the other theme that we're working very much at the moment, and is how do you, as a city, create digital safety? So we have all this focus on the safety on our streets, the people on our streets, and we just talked about the demonstrations on our streets. But what we are, of course, now seeing is a lot of what we're doing is happening online. And all of our conversations we have here, physically, us two talking together. We've just, a few weeks ago, we had our conversations on LinkedIn, right? So we have all these conversations, which is very positive. But that also means that we start to see a lot of hate. We also start to see a lot of recruitment that goes on online to extremist groups. And of course, there's been a lot of inspiration to the terrorist attacks we've seen the last couple of years has been from online groups. So a lot of the hate suddenly manifests itself in these online spheres. So what we're looking at now is what is then the city's role within this, and is there a role? Yes, but what is then that role for the city, for the police, for the civil society? And I think this is something that is really moving at the moment, and I am very happy to see that we are starting to talk about this, that our prevention on the street needs to be done in very much as a prevention on the online street as well. You cannot disconnect these two things, and we've seen it, just the attacks, the things we saw in the States in the very beginning of the year, where a lot of people attacked the Capitol. All of this happened online, these conversations, and led to an attack in the physical world. So we need to know what goes on online, and how do we then prevent this polarization that actually happens when you have all this hate here. So that's a theme, and we have a project with Malmö City right now where we are looking into, where we're monitoring the hate online for Malmö to better be able to prevent. They now get a bit of knowledge on what actually happens online, what is the hate, who is it targeting, and how do we then prevent that in our preventative efforts.
In the other report I saw, you also mentioned gamification of the extremism groups just coming to, for example, Discord or other platforms for people just playing games and trying to just find some young or people just to join.
Exactly. And they take advantage of all these young people who are on these platforms and maybe are looking for some other communities. And that's sometimes what you see these extremist groups are pretty good at, and creating these communities and a sense of belonging to other groups. And that's what we see. And yes, that's also what we see with gamifications, is that that not even there you are totally safe. And that's, of course, also why a lot of our cities are working on the whole, how do you behave online and digital education, I guess it's called. So how do you as a young people approach being online, and what should you listen to and what not, and misinformation, disinformation, all that. Yeah. And that, I guess, also relate to another theme that we have been looking into the last couple of years. And that's, of course, the whole COVID and pandemic. And that is very connected to the online sphere again, because we have a lot of young people who is suddenly stuck at home behind a computer, very bored, which is naturally. But that means, again, we have seen how extremist groups have taken advantage of that. And we need as cities to look into what is then the role of the cities here. How can we help our young people feel more connected, even though they are disconnected to the world during a pandemic? And here we've also seen a lot of demonstrations towards these lockdowns and restrictions and anti-government demonstrations. And that's, of course, also something that we need to take serious, because it certainly connects a lot of people who is actually normally not agreeing on the other points, but this is something that they agree upon. So how to approach that? And luckily we are, at least in the Nordic region, slowly getting out of this pandemic. But then now is the question, how do we get out of this in a good way and make sure that people, their mental health and all those issues are taken very good care of? And then we have two other themes. One theme is then looking into the governance and how you build alliances as a city. And that's, of course, with other parts of the department, other organizations, but also with your civil society. We see that civil society are often the ones who are closer to the people. They can often also get out to groups that perhaps the city or the police cannot get out to. They perhaps have a higher level of trust and so on. So that's very much related to how do we then collaborate even stronger with these organizations. And then lastly, we have a theme, which I think is the most important theme for today, which is, of course, the whole how do we create safe urban spaces, which is very connected to all the other things that we do. But this is, again, having a focus on looking at our cities, the street, not just for transport or functionality, but also as a place where we can actually create more equality and non-discrimination, openness, and unite the people that we have in our cities. So that's a very important theme for us here in Nordic Safe Cities the last couple of years, and will continue to be.
And this is exactly the point where we talk about the new Safe Urban Spaces publication that you've released together with SLA architects. And maybe just to introduce this project, which was very, very exciting to me. You created this Safe Urban Spaces task force, where for like 1 year you've been investigating the measures for how should the safe urban spaces work. And you published the report, which I, of course, will add link to in the episode's description. So everyone who feels interested can just see and read the report. But maybe just if we can introduce this report, this publication, and also say what are the main findings and what is the kind of short story behind it as well.
Yeah, well, I think you did a very great introduction to it. But as a background, I think, again, this is a focus area that we should not forget, the whole urban space in our cities. And all of the dilemmas and issues that I just mentioned, they are, of course, not only related to our social relations, but also take their form in our physical space. We just talked about these demonstrations, but we also have hate groups and streets. We see a lot of racism in the streets. We see how we also build up protections and surveillance to protect ourselves from terrorism. So it's actually very physical the things that also come out from this fear for extremist groups and terrorism. So on the basis of that, we thought it was important to look into how can you as a city work with this area? How can you approach this? And I think, as I just mentioned before, we are in the Nordic region. We have some interesting models already. So we thought it was interesting to dive into what is then the Nordic model for creating that safety and inclusion in our urban spaces. And we did that together with the SLA architect, who has a very strong background in actually working a lot with nature as well. And they have also worked with the government quarter in Oslo, which is after the Breivik attack 10 years ago. The government quarter was also blown up with a bomb, actually. So based on that, SLA has worked on how do you then build up a quarter after such an episode. And that's, of course, not just building up the building. That's kind of the easy part. But the difficult part is to unite the people around you and the people who has experienced this and create a space here, which is, of course, for memory, but also for living on. And also a place where you don't just put up a lot of concrete and bollards and all that, but actually make it very involving. And SLA is very, very good at thinking into how to use benches and parks and nature to protect your area, but at the same time make people feel very included and welcome. So that's why we thought it was interesting together with them to dive into then what is then the Nordic model for working with this area, for both the more hardcore areas of protections against terrorism, but also with the whole working on safety in our urban space. How do we make people feel more safe, which is not always the same as security. So on the basis of that, we worked for 1 year together with a handful of our member cities, diving into some very concrete projects, and together with a lot of experts and professionals, we looked into what can we learn from this? What can we learn from our conversations with cities and city planners and architects and sociologists and so on? And then based on that, we came out with the publication here in June. Yeah, and you asked to the main finding in this publication. There's, of course, a lot, and I recommend everybody to read it. But if I should highlight one main finding or one purpose or something that I would highlight as very important when you work with urban spaces, and this might sound very common sense, but it is that you cannot work in silos or alone when working to create safe urban spaces. And I know this sounds very common sense. Of course, we work together, but I think we've worked for many years with our member cities to prevent that some of the most difficult issues and dilemmas in our societies. And when we take a look at our public spaces, these same issues take their form in the physical space. But we have experienced how the different departments in a city are not working together, or you see how different departments are working on the same issue from a physical and a social aspect, but not talking together, right? And that sometimes it leads to a lot of projects that are very similar happening, which is, of course, a shame. But it also sometimes leads to that you are not aware of the root causes of a problem, because you're not working holistic. You're not taking that holistic picture, so you're not getting to the root causes. And you end up perhaps removing one problem from one place to another, doing up the opposite of what you actually wanted. Like you put up a lot of light in one area, but then you cast a lot of shadow to a different area, right? Or you put up safety measures and bollards and security measures, but then you end up highlighting the risk of terror in the minds of people. Or the worst case, I would say, you listen to the guy who pays for the bench, but you don't listen to the guy who sleeps on the bench, right? So these are some of the things where we see the risk of not getting to the core issue of the problem. And that's why I think you really have to work together. And that's the most important message from our publication. And when I say work together, I don't just mean the different department in the city. I know that there's a lot of cities that do this very well. But I also mean the people who live in the city, the people who uses these urban spaces, who know how it is as a citizen. And I also mean to involve a lot of competencies like sociologists, anthropologists, business entrepreneurs, architects, cultural people, all these people who work together with city planners, bring them on board as well and talk to them because they know what goes on in a city as well. So that's the important message. Work together, city people, experts, everyone.
I also wanted to emphasize one more thing, because I thought that you will say about something else, because you also came up with all the principles of the safe space. And I will just mention there were 5 of them: to create local alliances, to starting with people and include rather than exclude, also work site specific, and design for positive behavior. And that are also like very vast things, I would say. So if we could just maybe narrow them down a little bit, or just explain in a more specific way. Because when we think about, for example, working site-specific, I also see this advantage of smaller cities in a way, because you said about those different departments working together, like not together, working on something, but separately. And then I can imagine that in smaller cities, it might be just easier to kind of come along and to communicate. So how would you approach those principles so they kind of can be just introduced in our cities, taking into consideration that the size of the city makes a difference, I would say. So the bigger the city, it might be probably just more difficult to introduce those principles because it's so interrelated organism.
I think you're right. I mean, the bigger city, the bigger work, and sometimes also the bigger problems. It's the bigger cities, for instance, that work a lot with the terrorism protections and so on, whereas the smaller cities luckily don't have to work so specifically with that. So I think you're right. There's of course a very big difference if you are big cities with a lot of departments and so on, whereas as a smaller city that might seem easier. But I think these principles that we've put up and that you just mentioned, they are, I would say, universal, and it might be in a different way that you work with this, and it might be easier for some than others. But I think at least these principles are thought as a way to guide the work you do in cities on urban space development. So it's of course not a handbook of, this is what you should do, but this is a way to emphasize the things you have to keep in mind when you work with urban development. And that is for decision makers, it's for city planners, and it's for all levels of the city, I would say, actually, to keep that in mind, and how to focus on the organizational, the social, and the physical aspects when you do urban planning and work with safety. So that's kind of, I would say, the purpose, at least for this. And I hope it makes a lot of sense. And of course, it says Nordic all the way through because it is a very Nordic way to work, holistic and interdisciplinary. It is perhaps more natural for Nordic cities and organizations to work more together. But I think this is still important to emphasize because I think we can get better at it. That's at least what we see. Yeah, so that's a more broad answer to what you asked about. But should I run through some of the principles with some examples? Or?
Maybe we can just give some short examples to those principles, because I assume that those principles are just something that you start with, and we probably will continue to explore them more or evaluate them more. And that's going to be my next question, like how should it be developed in the future?
This is, of course, just our first step. We had this task force with some cities where we dived into how are they working now. And this is some of the core principles that we drew out of this, and I think can guide you in the work that you do. But of course, the next step is now to see that how can we do that even better, and how can we perhaps exemplify this in some cities, try to work with this in cities and see it working, and perhaps also I would love to come up with some very concrete examples as well in a publication where you can actually see what is the Nordic model, the way of doing it. So there's definitely, this is just the first step that we started, but there is a lot more work to do here. But to give some examples of what it is that we mean with these different principles, you can say that looking into this first one, creating local alliances, that is of course connected to what I've mentioned several times, work together. And that you cannot create this in a vacuum. You have to involve all levels of the city. And I think that, I've seen a few cities who's actually worked with creating a vision for uniting the people around that. And that actually works very well. Again, it seems simple, but you've seen how Tesla and Apple have created very simple visions, computers for all, electrical car for all. And I know they've, of course, had a lot of other tools to reach that goal.
But some luck, maybe.
And some luck, perhaps also, and a lot of good timing. That also worked very well. But I think still you have these companies where you put up a vision that's simple, that everybody can relate to. Everybody can see that happen. And it's visionary. You say, okay, this is actually something where we see the end goal. And that unites the people around you. So it's easier to get the politician to stand up on his chair and say he wants to do this for this public park in his city, right? If he has a very strong vision, that makes it a lot easier to communicate, but also to unite the people around that. And I've seen it in several cities. We've seen it in Stavanger in Norway, where they had a park where they said, this park should be for everyone. And that sounds very, well, of course. But it wasn't. It wasn't when they started. People didn't feel safe. They didn't want to go there. There was a lot of drug addicts that was there, and they didn't feel safe either. So nobody felt safe in this public park. So they wanted to change that. And by saying that out loud, that it's for everyone, not just the woman with her kid and the stroller and the business person, but also for the drug addicts, then suddenly you get a lot of organizations and people to work around that. You suddenly get the Red Cross, you know that they are actually working within this area, then suddenly they have a role to play as well. Or we have Arendal, which is another Norwegian city who called it with a heart for Arendal, right? So it was about bringing in everybody's competencies, not just the city to create a safe city. It was everybody. Everybody had a role to play, and that was their ambition. Everybody had a role and everybody had a responsibility. So again, by saying this, having this clear vision and clear statement that you can all work into, that makes it sometimes, I know it's not always, and this again, it's a simplification of the real world, I know, but sometimes it helps unite it better and to have that collaboration if you're a big city or if you're a small city. So that's just an example of how you can think these building alliances in the work that you do. I think actually the one include rather than exclude, I would like to highlight as well, because I think it's quite interesting and also related to what I just said before about how you unite everyone in the work that you do. We have worked with our member cities and we've often experienced, the problem often seemed to be that there were people in an area that made other people feel unsafe. So the problem wasn't always that I just feel unsafe. It was other people who made me feel unsafe, right? So it was perhaps a lot of young guys hanging in a gang in this park, or you had drug addicts, or you had homeless people hanging around in these areas, and that made other people feel unsafe, right? So you had to go into that mechanism that happens there and look into how do we enhance the safety here for everybody here in this area. And we work with a partner called Kenneth Balford, who's a Danish artist actually, but he also works a lot with positive, he calls it bright design as opposite to dark design, right? And he highlighted how you have to remember that these people who are often in the park a lot more than others, perhaps the homeless people, the drug addicts, they also know this park a lot better than everybody else. So they often have a lot to contribute with. what happens in a park, what is actually going on, what happens at 2 at night, what happens in 7 in the morning, right? So they have this idea of what actually happens in this area. But these people also have needs, and they also feel unsafe often. So how can you involve them? And he had a very good point that these homeless people use the space as their living room. So how do you then take that into considerations when you work in an area? And that's the whole not excluding people, of course. And he has some very good examples, and we've seen some good examples of how you can create these safe havens for homeless people where they get in space in a park where it's okay for them to be. And suddenly, when you know, as the people who walk past them know that it's okay for them to be at that bench or that area, then they don't seem so scary anymore because they have that area. And for the homeless people, that's very nice because they have a place to put their stuff. They have, our good partner, Kenneth Balfeld, as he mentioned, he says they have a toilet, which is very nice when you drink a lot of beer. And that's a very basic need. But again, suddenly you have that in an area, and it's okay to create those spaces for these people. And you can also give them responsibility of that area. Maybe they are responsible for keeping the place clean, the public toilets clean, or they have a responsibility for the bicycle pump, so they can pump your bicycle and so on. So give them a role as well. And I think this is, of course, very related to people who are in some way feeling excluded of the society. But this, of course, also relates to the people who are very much included. You have to talk to them and figure out what are their needs and how do we make them feel more included in space.
Exactly. I think you should shift this perspective and way of thinking from talking about some excluded group into talking to the excluded group. And this is something that I think you are also trying to achieve with this point, which is very important, I would say. Like, you need to really approach those people as they know those places the most in many cases. And that's why I think it's very, very important.
And I think if I should give another example from our publication and from these principles, I think we have one that might relate a lot more to the whole architectural part. This is, of course, very related to how do we connect on a more social part, but of course, very related to how do you then build up places where people feel included. But we also have the last principle, which is called design for positive behavior. And that is, of course, related to if you have happy people, then it's actually easier to overcome and vanish some of the crime and feelings of unsafety in an area. So you have to build to support a positive behavior and also positive engagement. And by showing that you care as a city planner, that you've put a lot of energy into a place or a space, that also makes people feel that this is an important space, right? So you can do quite a lot. There's a lot of tools of that. And again, I think the architects are a lot better of explaining what you can actually do here. And I know that my perspective is perhaps slightly biased towards the more social aspects, but I think this is an interesting point of how you can use green areas, how you can use benches, and how you can build up your parks and spaces to create more positive behavior. And that's, of course, also related to if you keep the place clean, then other people will think, okay, I should perhaps put this trash in the trash can and not just on the street. But on the other hand, if you have graffiti areas that are not kept clean and you have a lot of trash, then people just continue down that road, right? But you can also graffiti can also be used as a very positive thing, right? So you have graffiti that can certainly make people feel unsafe if it's just like in a dark area. But if you highlight it and you bring it forward as a part of an art thing, then suddenly people feel like, wow, this is a very cool place. I would very much like to hang out here, right? So you can use these very small elements. And of course, that also relates to the point before about the light. I mean, if you bring a lot of light into an area, then of course that will also make it more difficult to hide. But you have to think about how you use this light, because you are also creating dark spaces when you have light. So how do you then include that so you don't just bring in suddenly these dark areas in the park, but think this light into the space?
I think that you kind of described those principles in a very detailed way, and that's what I wanted to achieve. So thank you for that. And I like the structure, how we kind of talked about the problems and different challenges that we have in Nordic cities, and not only, and also some challenges or also some solutions for that, which are in a very early stage, as we also discussed. So this is kind of a first step. And I hope that we encouraged the listeners to see the report, the publication. But before we finish, I also wanted to ask you more personal again about a book recommendation. Maybe there is something related to safety or something else.
Yeah, so you've asked me about this prior, and I really thought about that because, there's of course a lot of good books that you can recommend, but I have actually decided to recommend a science fiction book.
Okay.
Which is, I have to make a disclaimer now. This is my very first science fiction book, and I've never read anything like that. I've never even seen the Star Wars movies, right? So I'm a very rookie person into this field, and that might also be why a more experienced sci-fi person is perhaps not as blown away as I was by this book, because there's probably a lot of things that are common sense for a sci-fi reader. But I think this was a very unusual book, and it made me think a lot. It's 3 books. It's called the Three-Body Problem Trilogy. And it's a Chinese writer, Cixin Liu. Sorry for not pronouncing that right. But it's, of course, it's not that unusual. I think the whole Earth is awaiting a attack by the closest star system, right? So that's what happened. And that takes a lot of several hundred years. But during those years, a lot of things happens at the Earth. And it leads to humanity to face some interesting dilemmas and considerations on their own survival, right? So what happens when all hope is over, right? Is it war? Is it love? Is it hate? Is it despair? Is it extension? Is it escapism? Do you want to escape it all, right? So there's a lot of considerations that are explained quite well in this book. And I thought that was very interesting because it has a lot of morale. It has a lot of technology as well, which was interesting, but also a very philosophical way of approaching what will happen if the Earth suddenly wouldn't survive, right? But in this context, it also explains our future cities. So suddenly the humanity gets a chance to build up new cities, right? And how would they then look, right? And you have these cities that are suddenly underground, tree-like houses and all that, right? And flying cars, of course. That's one thing I know from science fiction. That's a common thing. But you have this, suddenly he's explaining the world like 200 years from now. How would we build it up, right? Our cities, how would they look? And our resources, what are we doing with the resources, and where do we get our food from, and so on. And of course, it also has a dimension of our cities out in space. Then how would you build that up? If you have all opportunities, how would you then build your city? Is it based on surveillance, or is it based on trust? And
is it based on safety?
Is it based on safety, perhaps, right? So I thought actually within this community of listeners that you have, I thought perhaps at least I would give it my very warm recommendations. I think it's perhaps several thousand pages long. It's huge, but it actually managed to keep me to read it all through with the excitement. So I think that says a lot from a non-sci-fi person.
No, I think it's a brilliant recommendation, and I will of course add the link to it as well. And I also wanted to provide the listeners with one last thing. So I just wanted to ask you, where can listeners follow your work? Where can they find your report and also the future projects, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, if they want to follow me, LinkedIn is, of course, the most obvious place, and very welcome to connect to me. And we, Nordic Safe Cities, have a webpage, and but I would actually recommend to follow Nordic Safe Cities on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. I will provide the links for that because we have a lot of good stories from our member cities. We feature a lot of the projects and initiatives that cities are doing around in the Nordics. So I think I of course have to say that, but I think it's very interesting to follow these pages. It's not just about us having a lot of meetings or workshops. It's actually stories from the cities. So please do connect with me at LinkedIn or us at our company webpage.
And since before we started the conversation, we talked a little bit in Danish, I just will say now mange tak.
Velbekomme, og tak.
Thank you very much, Lotte.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our discussion with Lotte, and I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and that it also gave you a lot of value and knowledge about how to design for safety and how we can't exclude some users or some groups of people from our public spaces, but how should we make them feel included and safe, and how can we make the public spaces in the cities be safe and including for everyone. It would be nice if you just check the publication about the safe public spaces done by Nordic Safe Cities and SLA architects, because this is the thing that interested me a lot, and hence I had the talk with Lotte. One more thing I wanted to talk about at the end of this episode is that I really encourage you to visit my website, where you can find all the information about the podcast, including a newsletter, which I'm creating for you. And you can just for free sign up to this newsletter, and every second week you will get the new episode, some behind the scenes, as well as some links to interesting conferences or some interesting books or other events and so on. So yeah, just feel free to sign up. And also, if you like this podcast, if you would like to support me in any way, also you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, as it will help me and my podcast to reach even more and more people, which will be very, very nice for me if I can reach more people with my message. So thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this episode one more time. And if you have any remarks, just let me know. Feel free to contact me. And I hope to see you or talk to you soon. Thank you.